It was the graveyard shift. I carried a cup of industrial-strength black coffee over to my desk and I logged on. Dozens of alerts waited for me. I rubbed the stubble on my chin and sighed. This wasn't the life that I had dreamed of when I had graduated, but along with my degree, I had acquired a mountain of debt, and the job gave me a regular wage. I worked for the agency, a branch of the government that operated outside the sphere of public accountability, all in the name of national security. I was a communications technician, a low-level grunt who was kept in the dark and had digital manure shoveled onto him. I opened the first alert. It was a sound file that had been captured as part of the agency's monitoring program. The program's digital tendrils reached out across the country and far beyond. Certain keywords and phrases would set off an alert, as would communications from select locations. I would then have to decide if an alert should be escalated. One day, AIs would be able to do this, but for now it was my responsibility. The sound file was 7 seconds long. I yawned as I pressed play. There was the hiss of background noise and then a man's voice said, "We are picking up increasing levels of underground activity. It's off the scale. Please advise." He sounded stressed, which was fair enough. From the snippet of information that I had, it sounded like he was in a stressful situation. But was it enough for me to send this upstairs? The sound file came with a transmission time and the location that it was sent from. I checked the transmission time. It was already 6 hours old. That didn't surprise me. We worked through the alerts as quickly as we could, but there was always a backlog which led to delays. Next, I brought up a map of the location and saw that it had come from a civilian research base in the Arctic. Smack bang in the middle of nowhere, according to the library image that I had on screen. I called up another view, this time taken from a satellite that had passed over the location just 2 hours before. I zoomed right in. A cold chill spread through my body. Where the research base had been, there was now only wreckage. The prefab units which the base had been constructed from were broken apart and twisted. I could make out equipment scattered across the icy ground. I stopped looking then because I did not want to see any human remains. My hand was shaking when I escalated the alert. When I had been going through the recruitment process to join the agency, I had had to do a basic medical. I had to be healthy enough to work a keyboard for 12 hours at a time without keeling over. That was it. While I sat on my ever-expanding backside at my workstation, I knew that there were other agency employees out there in the field, putting life and limb on the line, and this division of labor was fine by me. I was not built for danger. To help calm my nerves after seeing the satellite image, I went to get 2 donuts from the staff canteen. By the time that I had eaten them and was working my way through the never-ending list of stacked-up alerts, I was already putting the research base out of my mind. Other people who knew what they were doing and were being paid a lot more than me were dealing with it now. By the time my shift was over, my main concern was, would my lousy next-door neighbors have their TV on full blast all day again when I get home? This made it impossible for me to get any sleep. I had tried explaining that I worked nights so I needed some peace and quiet during the day, but they didn't care at all. I logged off, stretched, dragged myself out of my chair and I headed for the exit. Another graveyard shift was history. Only while I was looking for my pass to swipe myself out, my supervisor appeared. He normally stayed in his own office and communicated with me by messages, even though we only sat a dozen feet apart. Seeing him striding towards me and with a scowl on his face, it made my guts tighten. "Where are you going?" he asked, making it sound to me as if I was doing something wrong. Home?" I replied. He shook his head, crossing his arms over his chest, and said, "Oh, no, you're not. I just got a phone call from senior management. They want you upstairs in briefing room number 1, now. Your pass has been updated to give you access." And then he leaned in closer and growled, "I have no idea why they want you, but if you have done something wrong and it reflects badly on me, I'll make your life miserable. Capiche?" All I could do was nod miserably and trudge over the elevator. I had no idea either what was going on, but this all felt like a lose-lose situation to me. As the elevator rose, I thought wistfully about my neighbor's TV keeping me awake. All of a sudden, that didn't seem so bad after all. A couple of minutes later, the elevator deposited me on the upper floor of the agency building. I had never been there before. I blinked uncomfortably because of the early morning light which was streaming in through the windows, and I looked around. Everything was very shiny, including the door on the other side of the corridor. It opened and a man stepped out. He looked about my age, but he was clean-shaven and wore a crisp white shirt and dark tie, with a smart suit and shoes that were polished within an inch of their life. I was painfully aware of how crumpled my own shirt was, partly because I didn't even own an iron, and partly because this was the 3rd night in a row that I had worn it. He held out his hand and introduced himself as Agent Wilcox. We shook, and then he said, "This way," and he wheeled around and went back into the room. The place that I most needed to go was the restroom because of my increasingly disturbed guts, but I figured I'd better follow him. I took a deep breath and stepped into the room. A long and very shiny table dominated the space. A dozen gray-haired men, all wearing identical suits, sat around it. They looked uniformly somber. Wilcox was standing next to a screen set into a wall. An image taken from the satellite of the devastated research base filled the screen. I had no idea what I was meant to do, so I stood there feeling incredibly uncomfortable as Wilcox cleared his throat, and then he began to speak. "You've all been read into the fact that we were monitoring this location because there was an incident there 35 years ago. At the time, the command team believed it had been dealt with permanently, and no flags were raised when the new research base was sighted there 2 years ago. We now know, thanks to the alert received last night, that this was not a correct reading of the situation." He paused for a moment to let this sink in, and then continued. "No additional transmissions were made from the base last night, so we can state that the catastrophic incident was rapid and complete, which means that we're now in cleanup mode. A legend has been created for civilian use, stating that the damage was caused by seismic activity. Our next action is to find and eliminate the perpetrators of the incident. As we are all aware, the agency's resources are primarily focused on dealing with cyber threats. Additionally, we have boots on the ground in sectors 6, 18, and 31. We simply don't have the active personnel to send to the Arctic and deal with this. That's why I am suggesting that we resurrect the squad which dealt with this situation in 1988. This is a highly unusual approach, but we have a problem and I am proposing a solution." Having said this, he paused again and looked around the table. The suits glanced at each other. There was nodding and guarded smiles, and then one of them simply said, "Approved." Wilcox's arm twitched as if he was fighting down a salute, and then he replied, "Thank you, sir. We won't let you down." He started to stride out of the room and indicated that I should follow him. My guts churning and my head spinning. I did. We went back into the elevator, but instead of descending back to the safe, familiar ground levels, it took us up, and I found myself stepping out onto the roof of the agency's building. There was a helipad there, and standing in the center of it, a transporter helicopter. I had only ever seen one on TV and in movies before, and close up, it looked massive. This was a serious piece of kit. Wilcox turned to me and said, "Beauty, isn't it? Let's get on board and get going. Time is of the essence here." Me on a helicopter? No way, I thought. I can't," I tried to explain. "My shift is over and I need to go home now to rest up and then be back at my desk by 8 p.m. He shook his head. "The squad that I'm putting back together needs a comm specialist who's up to speed on all the latest tech, and I'm seconding you to that role. I'll clear it with your supervisor. Now get your backside into gear. You're a field agent now." "A field agent? No," I tried to protest, but my words were drowned out by the sound of the helicopter's blades whirring into action. On legs that felt like they had had all the bones removed, I staggered on board of the helicopter. To my immense relief, I saw that there was a restroom. It was seriously cramped, but I didn't care. I emerged a while later and weaved my way to a seat, where I strapped myself in. Through the window, I saw that we were soaring over the city. I had lived here for 5 years and thought that it was a dull and cluttered place. But seen from on high, the interlinking highways and clusters of buildings had an energy that made me think of the place in a whole new way. I even felt disappointed as we started to leave the city behind. The buildings grew more and more spread out, and we were soon passing over the ordered layouts of estates of family homes. On the edge of one estate, there was a sports field. I could make out the teams in a baseball game. And then they slipped away as well, and the countryside opened out ahead of us. Scattered farmhouses surrounded by fields began to dominate the view. I turned away from the window, a smile on my face. Despite everything, I realized that I was enjoying the ride. I wondered if there was a catering service on board. A triple sausage and egg muffin with a coffee on the side would have been ideal. I was just about to ask Wilcox how I ordered when the helicopter began to descend. I peered out at the approaching ground. It was a sprawling patch of weed-covered land bordering a property. We landed with a jolt. Wilcox turned to me and said, "Nathaniel Jones led the squad that handled the original incident. He had retired from the agency 8 years ago and has lived out here since then. We've kept a file on him, of course. There's a note in the file that you should be aware of. It says, 'Approach with caution.'" Leaving that comment hanging, he disembarked from the helicopter. I didn't see why I was needed, so I sat there staring into space until I couldn't ignore the dirty look that Wilcox was giving me. Reluctantly, I clambered out after him and followed as he strode towards the property. It was a ramshackle wood cabin sitting in the middle of a yard littered with broken machinery. A sign nailed to a stake read, "No trespassers, no hawkers, no officials." Does Jones know that we're coming?" I asked. "He doesn't have the internet or a telephone," Wilcox answered. "And the agency hasn't used carrier pigeons for 100 years, so no." Great, I thought, my guts once again twisting tight inside me. If Wilcox was scared, he wasn't showing it. He stepped up to the door and knocked on it sharply. The door creaked as it opened to reveal a man standing inside. I couldn't see his face, but I could tell that he wasn't pleased to have unexpected visitors by the way that he was pointing both barrels at us. I cowered. Wilcox said in an insanely calm voice, I am Agent Wilcox. I'm here to activate the clause in your contract which calls you back into service. Jones must have been a tobacco chewer because a hideous dollop of the stuff landed on one of Wilcox's very polished shoes. I figured that meant Jones wasn't keen on being an agency man again. Wilcox glanced at his shoe but kept his professional detachment intact and went on. The reason why is that there has been a new incident in the Arctic. It was at the exact same location where you and a squad of fellow agents zapped hostiles into oblivion back in the 1980s. At this, Jones lowered his weapon. His face was weathered and he had a thick gray beard. "Dang," he said. "You telling me they back?" "I am afraid so," Wilcox answered solemnly. "I have been authorized to bring the original squad back into service so that we can deal with the threat." To my surprise, Jones burst out laughing at this. "Are you serious, son?" he said when he had gotten control of himself. "More than half of the squad are with their maker and the rest of us are just plain old." Wilcox stood up straighter, cleared his throat and said, "Your country needs you." Jones looked him in the eye for a moment and then asked, "How much will my country pay me for my time? Tax-free, of course, and in cash." Wilcox named a price. It was more than I earned in a year, a lot more. And it sealed the deal. Jones grinned, revealing a row of stained and cracked teeth. I was introduced to Jones in passing, and then the two of them boarded the helicopter deep in conversation. I followed, grumbling under my breath all the way. 10 minutes later, we were back in the air. Jones was in the seat next to mine. He was fast asleep and snoring loudly. Wilcox, meanwhile, was tapping something into a tablet computer, while I was left thinking that it was too late to ask for a raise on my salary. And I was still trying to get up the courage to ask when the helicopter once more began to descend. I looked out to see where we were landing on waste ground behind a bar. It was a tight squeeze, and I dared not look as the helicopter blades almost shaved off some of the bar's guttering. I had no idea why we were here. By now, this came as no surprise. Despite being a field agent, I was still being kept in the dark and having dirt unloaded on me. Wilcox led the way out, followed by Jones, who I noticed was much more sprightly on his feet than me despite the age difference. We headed around to the front where faded letters painted on the window spelled out, Mulhoon's. From these cigarette ends and broken glass covering the ground, it was already clear that this was not a classy establishment. As I followed the other two inside, I realized that I had been generous. A sign above the door reading, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here," would not have been out of place. Despite the fact that it was only just after midday, the bar was shrouded in a dust-infected gloom. Men were hunched silently over glasses at the long dirt-encrusted bar. There were flies everywhere, little critters with no respect for personal space, and the smell of stale sweat and stale beer made me cover my mouth and my nose with my hand. I was a slob, but the patrons and owner of the bar had taken low standards to a new, nauseating level. It was bad, and even Wilcox's smooth veneer looked to have slipped slightly. Jones seemed unperturbed, though. He was looking over to where a group of men were gathered around a pool table in one corner of the bar. My eyes were adjusting to the half-light by now, and while trying to swat away the flies with one hand, I made out the pool game had an audience of half a dozen good old boys. One of the players had a baseball cap on backwards, and his gut hung down over his belt as he leaned forward to take a shot. He skewed the ball well wide, cursed, and then picked up a bottle of beer and took a long swig. The second player was tall and rangy, with a quick and smooth movement. He dispatched two balls into opposite pockets with one shot. I was impressed. His opponent, it turned out, was not. "Dang cheatin' son of a," he yelled out and smashed the now empty bottle on the side of the pool table. "I'll show you what happens to hustlers around here." He shouted and began to circle the table, waving the jagged edge of the bottle at the man that he had accused of dishonesty. The rangy fellow stood his ground until his raging opponent was closer, then grabbed the arm holding the bottle end. I winced. The sound of a bone breaking filled the bar, followed close after by a yelp of pain. The man who had been holding the broken bottle fell to his knees, clutching his broken arm. The people who had been following the pool game until moments before had stood watching the confrontation until then, but now it was clear whose side they were on. All 6 of them threw themselves at the man. A part of me wondered if we should help. Wilcox showed no signs of intervening though, while Jones just stood there with a smile adding more creases to his face. As it turned out, the fellow was fine all on his own. One of his attackers was propelled across the room and crashed into the bar. Another followed, almost landing at my feet. From the glazed expression in his eyes, I imagined that he was seeing some serious stars. The next 3 would-be assailants were dispatched in the same way. The final attacker, standing had backed away slightly. He clearly reckoned that he needed an advantage and grabbed a hold of a couple of pool cues, and then began to swing them around his head as if they were in a cheap action movie. The man didn't even blink. Using the pool table as leverage, he launched a boot into the other man's guts. The pool cues cluttered to the ground, followed by the man who had been holding them. The fight was done. The winner strolled over and went straight up to Jones. They high-fived and then Jones said, "McKinley, this is Agent Wilcox. I told him that we would find you here at this time of day. And this young man is the radio guy." Nobody had told me that that was my title, but I just went with the flow and listened as Jones explained how the squad was being resurrected and why. McKinley seemed to take all of this in stride and said that he was on board. He looked to have about 10 years on Jones, making him all the way in his 70s, which would have meant that he was in his late 50s when the original incident went down. Considering how he had just taken out 7 men with ease, I imagine that he must have been a tough SOB back in the day. I was glad that we were on the same side, and wondered who else would be joining us and if they would be cut from the same cloth. "Who's the next squad member that we need to track down?" I asked. "Tyler," Wilcox answered. He turned to McKinley. "You know where we can find him?" McKinley laughed and walked over to the bar. Most of the drinkers there had looked up from their beers and bourbons when the fight was going on, before returning to the business of the day by getting drunk. One of them had not moved at all. His forehead was propped against the bar and I realized that he was passed out. McKinley picked the drunk up and carried him over to us. "Meet Tyler," he said. A small smile played across Wilcox's face and he announced, "That's the squad complete." "That's it?" I said, but they were already leaving. I sighed. It was tempting to stay in the bar and drink myself into oblivion, but I wasn't ready to abandon all hope just yet. I steeled myself and I headed for the door. The others were strapped into their seats by the time that I climbed on board the helicopter. Tyler must have been helped because he was still dead drunk and out of it. The helicopter rose, leaving Mulhoon's in its wake. And it kept rising until the landscape was lost below the clouds. Wilcox announced our ETA at the site of the incident and then returned to his tablet. I was stressed and hungry and tired. I couldn't even remember the last time that I slept. And there was no way that I would be able to sleep in the helicopter. Now with Jones and McKinley snoring in stereo on either side of me, and Tyler mumbling in his stupor, and the way that the helicopter was rattling in the turbulence. I closed my eyes anyway. Please, just a moment's peace, I thought. And then I heard someone speak, and I opened my eyes. Wilcox was shaking my shoulder and telling me to wake up. What do you know, I had dropped off after all, though I had no idea how long I had been out for. I rubbed my eyes and stretched, and started to shiver. The temperature inside the helicopter had dropped dramatically. I peered out of the window. Through flurries of snow, I could just about make out a vast, white expanse below. It turned out that I had been asleep for hours because we were now flying over a bleak and frozen landscape. It was so different from anything that I had ever known before. Felt like I was looking down on an alien planet. While I was staring in awe, Wilcox was moving through the cabin telling everybody to get kitted up. And Tyler had come around but still looked mighty bleary as he followed his old colleagues towards the back of the cabin. I knew that I should follow them, but I had more pressing matters in mind. Wilcox, seeing that I hadn't moved, snapped at me. "You got a problem?" Yeah, actually," I replied. "I can't do anything until I eat. I'm starving." Wilcox scowled at me as he replied, "There are energy bars and fruit concentrates in the backpacks. You'll find them along with the cold weather gear in the storage racks along the way. Now look lively, we're about to disembark." And looking anything but lively, I hurried to the rear of the cabin and pulled on the layer of clothes which I hoped would keep me warm out there in the Arctic waste. The helicopter landed and I hurried towards the door. Just before I got there, Wilcox handed me a latest generation satellite phone, and then I stepped out of the helicopter and into fresh air. I cried out and fell with a clump onto the ice, and then lay there wondering why nobody had warned me that the helicopter hadn't landed, but was hovering a few feet above the ground. I groaned, and trying to ignore the smirks on the faces of the others, I dragged myself to my feet, only to promptly end up on my backside once more, when I was knocked over by the force of the downdraft from the propeller blades as the helicopter rose into the air. Mentally writing my resignation email from the agency, I stood up and I brushed myself off. The 3 old squad members were carrying seriously large weaponry, but that did not seem to be slowing them down one bit as they moved away at speed. Wilcox, who brandished a more streamlined weapon, kept pace. Not that I was impressed. Grumbling with every step, I followed them. Almost immediately, I began to struggle for breath, and after a few minutes, a stitch had spread across my chest. "How much further is it?" I called out between gasps. Wilcox gave me the bad news. "It's a mile to the research base. Once we've discovered the scene, we'll begin the pursuit." I grimaced and stumbled on. And by the time that we reached the base, I was so tired that I thought I was going to hurl. I sank to the ground and sat there gulping in air so cold that it burnt my throat. My eyes were watering, my nose was running, and I could feel the clothes that I was wearing under my cold weather layer clinging to my sweat-soaked skin. I can honestly say that I had never been so miserable in my life. Ahead of me, Wilcox, Jones, McKinley, and Tyler were moving among the wreckage of the research base. When I had first seen the remains on the satellite image back at my desk, I had been shocked. But as with any image seen on a screen, it's impossible to distance yourself from it. In this age of extreme information overload, what's one more disturbing sight? Sitting there, though, watching the squad make their way carefully through the debris, the tragedy of what had happened here hit home. I looked down, ashamed at feeling sorry for myself, and then climbed to my feet and set off after the others. I wanted to see if there was anything that I could do to help. When I caught up to them, they were talking quietly amongst themselves. "It's just like back in '88, Jones was saying. Tyler and McKinley nodded in agreement. Wilcox looked at Jones and said, "I've read the report filed after you completed the mission. It would help if you could run through the chain of events again. The more detail that I have, the better it will be." Jones' eyes narrowed, and I wondered if he was struggling to recall what had happened, because the memories had faded with his age. I realized that I couldn't have been more wrong as soon as Jones began to speak. "It was September 17th when the call came through, 0800 hours. A military base carrying our covert research had been attacked. There had been a panic transmission which had made this clear, and then radio silence. Nobody knew the nature of the attack, and the army were gearing up to go in heavy, but that takes time. There were 9 of us in the squad then. We were specialists in entering high-risk situations where maintaining secrecy was key. So the agency activated us, and we were always going to get there first. We reached the site of the incident and confirmed that the destruction was widespread. Whatever had caused it had hit hard and fast. After confirming that there were no survivors, we began to follow tracks in the ice heading northwest from the destroyed base. There had been no fresh snowfall, so it was a clear trail. All the members of the squad had tracked animals, but none of us had seen anything like this before. I don't mind admitting to you now that I was scared. On early maps where the map makers had no information about a particular area, they wrote, "Here be monsters." And as we followed the tracks, I felt that we were entering unknown territory, that there would be monsters waiting for us. Jones paused, and he seemed to be overwhelmed with emotion. It was disconcerting to see such a tough man struggling in this way. He took a deep breath before continuing. "As you know from the report, we encountered them 5 clicks from the base. We engaged with maximum prejudice and prevailed, though we lost 2 men, good men with young families. After doing a final sweep of the area to check that there were no more of the things alive, we made our way back to the base. The army had arrived by this time. They were busy clearing the site, and we left them to it. All we wanted at that stage was to evac the site and mourn our comrades, and we thought that was it, that it was job done. Turned out that we couldn't have been more wrong. The dead here are testament to that." Once again, Jones' voice began to break. As hard as he was, his heart was not made of stone. Wilcox had listened without interruption and now said, "I've seen the Army's report as well. There is no mention of them searching below the foundation level of the wreckage. My theory is that the things left a nest underground, and now the next generation have hatched. I will order this area to be deep sanitized so that does not happen again. But first, we got ourselves a bug hunt. Let's move out." I had so many questions. One was more urgent than the others. "A bug hunt? What do you mean by that?" I asked. But they were all already moving away from the wreckage and nobody answered. Just typical, I thought bitterly and jogged after them. The snow had begun to fall, accompanied by a wind which made the flakes swirl. If the weather deteriorated further, I was worried that it would be easy to lose sight of the others if they got too far ahead. As it was, I could see they were following a broken line of marks in the ground. But ahead of us, the snow was already beginning to cover the tracks. Their outlines were still visible, but I wasn't sure how long that would be the case. 15 minutes into the pursuit, we lost the tracks. Wilcox turned to me and said, "Can you access satellite images on the phone? We need to know where the bugs are." I think so," I replied. "And if you can order pizza while you're at it," Jones added with a grin. As much as I would have loved pizza at that moment in time, I ignored him and got to work, seeing if I could source satellite images of the area. Surprising even myself, I did. The satellite had made a pass 50 minutes ago. I scrolled across the image, seeing only an unbroken expanse of white, and then paused. I had been going too quickly and missed something. I went back and saw a darkness on the ice. I zoomed in and the darkness fractured into sharp specks. It was the bugs it must have been. They were 7 miles away to our south. I showed the image to Wilcox and Jones, who whistled under his breath and then said, "There's more of the critters than last time, a lot more. That stacks the odds in their favor." Wilcox did not seem fazed. "I'm here to exterminate, not to be exterminated, and negativity is not a part of the game plan. Are you on board with that?" Jones shrugged. "And just wished I had negotiated a bonus based on number of bugs killed. Other than that, I sure am. We got a trek ahead of us, so the sooner we get going, the better." Wilcox smiled to himself. "I have a better plan. I have a theory that they respond aggressively to movement. So rather than expending energy by going to them, let's invite them to come to us." He reached into his backpack and took out a flare gun. He aimed it high into the air and dispatched flare after flare. Explosions of light filled the sky. Wilcox seemed satisfied. "Now we wait," he said quietly. The others seemed content to do this. They stood there cradling their weapons and staring into the distance. I couldn't see a trace of fear on their faces. I was not like them, and I never would be. I started to shake. It was as if there was an electric current being passed through my body and my entire body shook. I clenched my jaw tight, trying to get control of myself, but that made my teeth clatter worse. I was breathing hard as well through my nostrils, the brass frosting in the air in front of me, and I could feel the frantic beat of my heart. But still we waited. I scanned the horizon and my imagination ran riot. It felt like we were waiting for the end of the earth, for an apocalyptic incident to tear the sky and land apart. By my side, one of the others, I don't know who, said quietly, "There." In a silence broken only by my labored breathing, the single word was very clear and ominous. My heart pounded faster. I squinted into the distance but still couldn't see anything. "What is it? What have you seen?" Slowly and calmly, Wilcox raised an arm and pointed at the horizon. And finally I saw movement. It was a dark shape and it was moving quickly, heading straight for us, and it was not alone. There were 6, 10, 24. I swore under my breath. More and more of them were coming into view. The empty landscape was now a mass of dark movement. I tore my gaze away from the terror rushing towards us and looked at the others. None of them even had their weapons raised. "Blast them," I pleaded, "before it's too late." Jones shook his head. "They're not close enough," he said, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Not close enough, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They looked close enough to me. Each bug was as big as a grown man. Each had 6 sharp long legs. Their thoraxes were thick slabs. Fear transformed these in my mind into armor-plated sections of some terrible machine. Their hideous forms ended in bulging abdomens. As they came closer still, I could see their jagged mandibles and their segmented eyes, which seemed to glisten with malevolent intent. Finally, the others were raising their weapons. "Hold," Jones said. "Hold." As the nightmare rushed on, a dark tide of grotesque bugs that was about to envelop us. "Fire," Jones said. A storm of noise and light broke as the weapons discharged. Instinctively, I moved to cover my ears with my hands and closed my eyes for a moment. When I looked up, the world had become a blur of bugs being cut apart by burst after burst of a scything line of weapon fire. Shards of their casing spiraled away, and thick liquid sprayed out. I was struck again and again by the remains of dead and dying bugs. A severed mandible sliced open my cheek. I howled in pain and tasted bug blood as it flew into my open mouth. Nausea rushed through me and I staggered forwards, almost colliding with a still whole bug until it was sliced in two. I blinked in the haze and saw Jones grinning as he let loose round after round of destruction into the attacking horde. The bugs were on every side of us. They were racing over the bodies of their fallen kin in their desperation to get at us. The momentum of some carried them over our heads. Others propelled themselves straight at us, each to be met by terminal force. All I could do was stand there in abject terror. I was in Hades and this torment felt eternal. A bug was hit inches from my face and I was blinded by the explosion of body parts. I fell to my knees, clawing at my face and gagging. I spat out a final burning trail of bile and I looked up. There were bug bodies everywhere, but there were no more living ones rushing at us. The others had turned and were holding their weapons steady. They still had their fingers on triggers, but none of them were firing. They were watching the bugs that had survived scuttling away. The bugs were running, and I thought with a rush of hope that we had won. I punched the air in triumph. The others, though, looked stern-faced. Wondering why, I scrambled to my feet and saw that the bugs were beginning to loop back on themselves. I realized with horror that they were not fleeing. They were encircling us. In under a minute, we were trapped inside a ring of bugs. "What are they doing?" I asked. It was Wilcox who replied. "Learning. They understand now that a head-on assault won't work, so they're going to try to come at us from all sides." Fear rushed through me at this prospect, and I looked around at the circle of bugs. They were keeping their distance, but they were very animated. One began to clack its mandibles together, an action that the rest soon joined in with to raise a terrible sharp beat. The sound grew louder and louder until I thought that I was going to lose my mind. "Why don't they just attack?" I cried out. "Why don't they just get it over with?" The others were looking at each other, and I could see from their expressions that none of them had an answer for me. We had no choice but to wait. Or did we? I suddenly remembered the satellite phone. I had dropped it during the attack, but all I needed to do was call for help. The transporter helicopter could rescue us. I began to look around frantically for the phone. I couldn't see it at first and had the awful feeling that it was somewhere under these sickening remains of the bugs. I got back down on my knees and, fighting down a new wave of nausea, I began to dig through the chunk-filled slime. And there it was, under a bug's split open abdomen. Ignoring these slithery organs, I grabbed the phone, wiped its screen partially clean with my sleeve, and began to punch at the keys. Nothing I did, though, made the device activate. I swore at it and shook it and was about to start banging it against the ground to see if it would make the cursed thing work, when I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Jones. "Leave it, son," he said in a gentle voice. I dropped the satellite phone and began to weep. I was ashamed by my behavior, but I couldn't help myself. After a while, the tears subsided and I wiped my face miserably and looked up. The others had formed their own small defensive circle and were staring defiantly out towards the ring of bugs, which had begun to move. Their first assaults had been carried out at speed. This time, though, they were inching forward. As they moved towards us, it was like watching a shadow spread across the ground. Slowly, the terrifying darkness crept on. Their mandibles were silent now, and the only sound that I could hear was my own ragged breathing. The bugs were 12 feet away and then 10. The others had their weapons raised and shouldered, and I could tell that they were about to fire. I couldn't see how they could keep the bugs from overwhelming us, though, not when they were going to come at us from every direction. I closed my eyes. I couldn't look, and all I could hope was that it would be over quickly. And then I heard a noise. It sounded far away, but it was a noise that I recognized. Hope flickered inside me. I looked up and into the sky. The beating of blades was growing louder, and I could see a craft in the distance. it was not alone. 3 helicopters were speeding towards us. The cavalry was here. As they neared us, they swooped low and began to rake the ground on the outer rim of the circle of bugs. The bugs began to scatter in a blind panic. Seeing this, Jones hollered triumphantly. McKinley and Tyler joined in as they patted each other on the back. Wilcox, with a big smile on his face, applauded. The helicopters which had come to our rescue were leaner, meaner crafts than the transporter that had brought us here, and they carried the decals of the army. Our country's army. We were a long way from home, and this was like seeing a friendly face. While we whooped and clapped, the bugs continued to scatter in waves. And now that we were out of the line of danger, I steeled myself for the helicopters to begin raining down total destruction and finish the job that we had set out to do. This was no time for mercy. These bugs needed to be wiped from the face of the earth. But I was shocked when their armaments fell silent and nets were thrown out of the helicopter. These were vast, tightly woven sheets of mesh weighted around the edges. As they landed, they covered and caught the bugs, which thrashed wildly to try and break free. But the more they struggled, the more entangled they became. With all the bugs captured, the helicopters descended to the ground. Soldiers piled out of each and ran towards us. As they did, they started to yell at us to get on the ground and pointed their weapons at us. And suddenly, I didn't feel saved. I felt under attack again. Pleading for mercy, I fell to the ground with a cold metal barrel pressed against the back of my head, and a soldier screaming in my ear. I had not put up a fight, but I could hear the others protesting. They were demanding to know what was going on, and for the soldiers to stop threatening them. It all seemed to no avail. I glanced timidly up and saw a pair of shiny army boots walking our way. The rest of the man's uniform was equally razor sharp. The soldiers made way for him, and when he spoke, it was with the air of certainty of an officer. The army is taking over this situation now. You will be transported back to a military facility where you will be processed. You don't have the authority, Wilcox broke in. Look around you, son, the officer sneered. You're outnumbered by my men. This is a done deal. As long as you destroy the bugs and sanitize their nest, we'll leave quietly, Wilcox replied. The officer laughed out loud at this. You agency boys really are dumb hicks. The bugs are far too valuable. They're going to be taken back to our research centers and weaponized. This should have happened 35 years ago, but you losers killed all the viable specimens. Now get these dogs out of my sight. This last, contemptuous remark was shouted out as an order, and I found myself being dragged to my feet, marched to one of the helicopters and manhandled inside. The others were bundled in after me. Marshaled by armed guards, we were forced to huddle together in a circle on the floor of the helicopter as it was powered up. And then we were rising into the air no longer as free men. We were prisoners of the state. They're idiots, Jones muttered. If even a single one of the bugs escapes near a built-up area, the consequences don't bear thinking about. Idiots who hold all the cards, Wilcox replied bitterly. And I wish I could say their actions come as a shock to me, but they don't. The agency and the army have had their run-ins before. We all salute the same flag, but that does not always mean we're on the same side. So what are we going to do? Jones demanded. Wilcox shook his head sadly. I'll speak to my bosses at the agency as soon as I can, but I don't think it'll make any difference. The army's gonna disappear with the captured bugs and deny their existence. My nerves were shot and I was exhausted, and hearing the despair in Wilcox's voice was the final straw. I curled up on the floor of the helicopter, and despite the cold and the vibrations rattling right through to the marrow of my bones, I fell into a fitful sleep. When I woke, we were no longer moving. Every fiber of me ached, and it took me an age to drag myself to my feet. The guards watched me suspiciously, maybe wondering if I was going to try and pull some kind of trick. There was no chance of that. I was a broken man. As I stepped out of the helicopter, I was handed over to a new set of grim-faced soldiers. They snapped restraints on my wrists and I was pushed towards a waiting jeep. Jones, McKinley, and Tyler were being led into another jeep. Their ankles were in restraints as well, and they were forced to shuffle. Unlike me, though, they had their heads held high. Wilcox was already in a third jeep, and he was not in any restraints that I could see. I guessed he was getting what passed for the VIP treatment because of his status. He was, after all, a bona fide senior agent. The 3 members of the old squad were yesterday's news, and as for me, well, I was taken back to a dark place to have more manure shoveled on my head. I had used to think that I was trapped in a lousy situation because I had noisy neighbors who kept me awake, and a job that wasn't going anywhere. But that was nothing. I was incarcerated in a windowless room that was 4 paces wide and 10 paces long. There was a steel bed with a narrow mattress and a thin blanket, and a hole in the ground. Twice a day, a hatch in the bottom of the door opened and a tray was slid through. Every day it was dried out meatloaf day in custody. I lost track of time insanely quickly, but I think I had been locked in that room for around 2 weeks when the door clicked and it was opened by a man wearing a dark suit. I was so disoriented by this point that I didn't ask him who he was, or where he was taking me, as he led me down a featureless corridor. Another door was opened for us and we emerged into the night. I wish I could say that things worked out after this, that the army and the agency apologized for the way that I was treated and I was given financial compensation, that I found out that Wilcox and the old squad were at liberty, and that the bugs had been destroyed. But none of that happened. I was taken to a car which drove through the night, until we arrived in a city that I did not recognize. I was given an envelope containing $200, a new fake identity card and social security number, and told to walk away. That was almost 2 years ago now. I work in a diner washing dishes and spend any spare cash that I have on cheap booze that burns as it goes down, but leaves me numb for a few hours at least. And as I lie there in the dark in my claustrophobic room, there's only one thing that I know for certain anymore. The true monsters in this world walk on 2 legs.